Now, you've got the recent annual meetings of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the banks known as the Ebrd, include a focus on economic prospects for regions around the world in the face of sticky inflation, high interest rates, and huge debts across the developing economies. Let's get some insights into this from this panel at the meeting, headlined by top economists and policy analysts.
It's worth mentioning Central Europe and the Baltics. Last year, that region essentially saw zero growth. Countries like Estonia saw their economies shrinking by almost 3%. This year, things are better. There will be a 3% growth in Poland and in Croatia. But of course, prices of natural gas in Europe are 4 times as high as in the US. And the weakness in Germany will grow by 0.2% this year. So essentially very little increase in economic activity. That weakness of Germany means lower export demand for our regions of operations, particularly for Central Europe. Now, on the positive side, Central Asia will be the fastest growing region among our regions of operations. If you remember, in 2022, it received influx of capital from Russia. Many businesses from there moved to the region, as well as many people, including some very highly skilled professionals. IT businesses are quite notable in that respect. And this influx is still paying dividends. Also, intermediated trade, even though it reached a plateau, it continues fuel economic activity. And of course, strong demand for commodities.
From the war in Ukraine in terms of commodity prices, wheat, I mean, this region is the largest wheat importer, plus, of course, the pressure on energy prices, but also, of course, some regional shocks, the impact of the war on Gaza. We cannot even yet fully understand the extent of which it will have an impact on these key drivers of the economy, such as tourism, but also Suez Economic Canal revenues that are down 50% just since the beginning of the year, which are a lifeline also, of course, and a key contributor for FX for a country such as Egypt, which also in and of itself plays an important role for the region. So muted growth prospects, and I think we will later also talk about the challenges around the inflation, coupled with a little bit of some of the domestic challenges of some of the countries in the Eastern Mediterranean region. More stability and economic structural reform momentum in Morocco. Egypt, a bit of a more bumpy ride, but big macroeconomic improvements with the IMF program, the liberalization of the exchange rate, still domestic struggles in Lebanon that really prevent growth moving forward. And Jordan, of course, also depending on tourism and the stability of the region, which is difficult. And then, of course, we're also looking at the West Bank and Gaza, which has the most direct impact of the war, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank economy, where over 20% of GDP depends on workers working in Israel, and the disruptions there are really important contributors to the recession there. Tunisia, it's a bit of a mixed picture. We do see some growth prospects, and the latest bigger packages from the EU have really helped stabilize some of the challenges on the fiscal side. But of course, growth is also still subdued, mainly there on the back of a very, very poor agricultural performance this year. So a mixed picture, a challenging picture. We have the global challenges, some specific regional challenges, and on top of it, some sort of domestic political challenges on the structural reform side. So never dull in the southern and eastern Mediterranean region, but also a lot of challenges in particular this year.
It's very, very important to realize that the US economy has performed despite similarities in inflation, I think in large part accidental, to do with the energy price shock being so huge for Europe. But the US economy has really been going gangbusters in the last few years. Between 2019 and 24, real GDP per head in the US rose by more than 8%, according to IMF forecasts for this year, while the only larger European economy to get close to this, interestingly, is Italy, which managed 6%. And the other big European countries are close to zero, and that includes the UK, or even negative. So they're completely different GDP performance. And in the US, that has gone with very strong demand, strong employment, very low unemployment. And yet, interestingly, inflation figures have ended up looking a little similar, and I think that's in significant measure accidental. And that's very important in understanding the divergence. In the US, it looked 6 months ago as though they really were going to achieve immaculate disinflation. Inflation was going to fall to target. Interest rates were widely expected to be lowered significantly by the Fed this year, really back towards normal. Now that looks considerably less likely. The Fed is much more cautious, and I think it's probable that we're not going to see more than one or at the most two cuts this year, and interest rates in the US will remain high. It's of course still possible that all this monetary tightening will suddenly have a really big effect on the US economy, but we're not seeing it yet, just signs of it. Europe is, I think, really different. The big shocks have passed. The domestic demand growth has been weak. Many people feel the ECB was too cautious, and we expect cuts to start in the ECB by the ECB next month. And I would expect rates to fall significantly in the course of this year. Some divergence between the US and Europe and on monetary policy, all assuming, of course, no more really big shocks. So we are getting out of the big inflation period, but it looks as though it's going to be really quite tricky, particularly in the US, and of course that has very great significance for the world economy.
And particularly, I think, in the aftermath of really big negative supply shocks. I think there are many parallels here to the story of the 1970s, but central banks are behaving better than they did in the 1970s. But there are also parallels to previous supply shocks. And it's because I think there are all kinds of feedback loops that are put into the inflationary process. That is, if you think of Egypt, for instance, Egypt is massively hit by the Russian attack on Ukraine and the basically stopping for some time of the grain trade across the Black Sea. So Russia, Ukraine were big suppliers of Egypt. But then you get after that a susceptibility to other supply shocks, and we find some that are just the result of chance, ships getting stuck in the Suez Canal, or the water level being too low in the Panama Canal, but also terrorism, the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. It goes on and on and on, and everybody who sits on some kind of supply choke point is going to use that. So that's one dynamic. And then if we're thinking about the industrial countries, there's an element of wage pressure that's now going on, and particularly, as Martin was saying, the economy in the United States is very, very hot. There are many, many labor shortages, but you find labor shortages even in the countries in Europe where growth is very low, because we're in the middle of a retransitioning phase. That also comes, I think, in the aftermath of supply shocks, that you need to move from one kind of labor force to another kind of labor force, and in that transition we find really big difficulties and big pressures.